Right. Hello, everybody. Time for another exciting broadcast slash video for your Comm 210 online section. Today we're going to go over language, expression, and how to create a survey that is good and engaging. I'm sorry. Wow. See, I'm my head must be in another place. I just came in from outside watering the flowers. It was scorching out there. My brain must be fried. Uh, no, it's gonna be how to create a good survey to get good information to make your speech engaging. Eloquence. I'm a speech teacher. Okay, I flapped my gums for a bit. I'm sure the link is updated. Let's get that out to you. I apologize if you're watching this later and you're just watching me fumble around with this title card. I feel like I do that every broadcast. Apologize for this, I mean. But it's a necessary evil. I really wish they would give each speech a unique ID before you start broadcasting. But they don't. They just don't. So, you know. There we go. Don't. There we go. Streamception there. All right. Let's go ahead and open up the. Oh, my monitor changed to viewpoint because of the PowerPoint I had displayed. All right. Section 800. Let's do this thing. 10th broadcast. Woo! I think that is officially the well, it's kind of like I said, it's not quite actually 10 weeks. We're probably at the 60% mark, not the 50% mark. Okay, 10th broadcast, a link-a-rooney. Here's the link. So there it is. Send out a copy immediately, please. Okay, there we go, just like clockwork. Let's bring up our PowerPoint. Which one of these do I actually want to do first, actually? Let's consider that. There we go. Yeah, let's talk about language first because the survey is going to be your assignment. So I figure we'll end on that so that's freshest in your mind, even though you could, in theory, watch this at any time and in any order by using the seek around on the button, assuming you're not watching live, of course. Let's swap the presenter view. Let's minimize the notes. Let's roll up there we go. Language, wording your ideas. A PowerPoint I used the last section. All right, so language what exactly is language? And language is really any kind of system of symbols. So when we think about language, it's just symbolic. Um, and I'm sure you'll get into way more detail in an actual linguistics course. But really, what the symbols are is that they stand for ideas. Language is a way of trying to put an idea from my head into your head. Um, and some ideas. This process is not perfect, and we kind of talked about its flaws way back in the first week when we talked about the SMCR model and noise. But you also have to remember there's another, it's not really, I wouldn't really classify it as a source of noise, but, for example, when someone says, I'm sad, or I'm in pain, that's probably a better example. If they say that I'm in pain, you know how in the doctor's offices, they often have like a chart about, what number would you rate this pain? And then maybe they have some guidelines for you on the chart a little bit, like, a 1 is, a paper cut. 3 is you stubbed your toe. A 10 is you stepped on a Lego brick. A 7 is giving birth. That kind of thing. And that way there's really a subjective term like I have some pain. They can kind of get a better idea of what you mean by that because what is painful for one person, other people may have a higher tolerance. So language is difficult. There's some inherent loss of meaning in there. But it's because that the words I am saying or the words you were writing or the little pictures that you're drawing, they might stand for ideas, but everybody even though they share a language, they share a common system of symbols, there's still some, well, irregularities from individual to individual. I just wanted to get that out there. So it's a source of it's a way of getting ideas from my head to your head. That's what language essentially is, through using symbols. But it's not perfect. And it can't be, because as long as people have different ideas about what is painful, what is sad, um, what tastes good, things like that, you're never going to know exactly what ideas are rolling around in another person's head, even though we have this system of symbols that uh, is the aim of which is to help us find out. One component of language, at least when we talk about spoken language, is phonology. And this is the study of language sounds, or the sound of words. Remember, the words I am saying are not actually the ideas, they just represent ideas, right? Um, Phonology is a system of just kind of understanding what sounds a particular language or languages share, have, and maybe what those sounds mean. Um, and then we have syntax, which is a grammar structure and seeing how messages are kind of put together, and semantics, which a lot of people like to use. Oh, we're just talking about semantics. What they really mean, or let's hope what they mean, is that we're talking about the meaning of words and symbols, and this is often a very actually important discussion. Um, now, when people talk about, we're just talking about semantics here, it's almost like they're trying to dismiss the discussion, but the reality is. Um, you do need to come to a kind of common understanding of what the difference is between a smell is and what a stench is. And that difference, or that line in the sand between where you call something a smell and where you call something a stench, might be different for everyone. Society, the people who share a common language, can agree that there is a certain point in the sand where a smell becomes a stench, right? And that idea, or the idea or try of trying to do that, is a discussion about semantics. And it's very important, especially when we talk about important issues, that we have a common semantic system. Trying to resist that by dismissing a discussion about semantics as a discussion about semantics is not really productive for anyone. But that's just my 2 cents. Then we have the pragmatics, which is the study of how language is often used, and it's usually by native speakers, but of course, pragmatic scholars, or scholars about this area of language. They also study how non-native speakers use words, and they often have a difference. So, for example, um, when we talk about in American English, when we talk about buying a plane ticket, we would describe it as buying a plane ticket, right? We're going to fly somewhere, um, and we buy a plane ticket to do that. Now, in other forms of English, um, you might actually describe it as a fly ticket, right? Because you're buying a ticket to fly, and so it makes more sense that you're not buying a ticket to plane, right? So some other areas of English might call it a fly ticket. Um, that would be, again, an issue with semantics, but also something of pragmatics. People who share that understanding pragmatically understand that a fly ticket is a plane ticket. And when we hear it here in American English, if someone talked about a flight ticket, you're thinking like, are you buying a ticket to see a housefly circus or something? Remember those old bug circuses they used to have? I think they still give them to kids. Um, anyway, characteristics of language. So there's some symbolism. Okay, words symbolize individual thoughts, and don't forget gestures, facial expressions, punctuation, all of that jazz symbolizes thoughts. And this is done through a process of abstraction. So thoughts are abstract. Again, you can't really nail down what is painful. You can't really nail down um, whether something tastes good. You can't really nail down a lot of concepts. Really, the only things that maybe are um, really something that you can nail down. One of my programs is making a lot of noise here. Let me resolve that for you. Okay, go away. Excellent. Um, you can't have a one-to-one relationship. In other words, that's why you can't be concrete. So words, you try to use common experiences that are common to everybody to represent things that are really, truly unknowable. And here I have my old example standby of sad versus morose. All right. Um, get the hell out of here, man. How unprofessional that I have my personal software wanting to butt in here. Let me close that out to make sure it stops bothering us. I had just dismissed that window too. Like apparently I didn't actually close out of the program. So get out of here. Oh, almost any kind of problem I can have, I end up having it, don't I? All right. So now that we're back, I think. No, still got the title card on there. Oop. There we are. It can also be influenced by our perception. So how one views the context of certain information can create new meanings. So let me try to think of a good example here. Um, well, for example, when we talk about being politically correct, that whole discussion is really about how language um, and its use can really affect our perception of certain things as a society. And maybe some of those perceptions aren't very flattering. Um, so I actually had a discussion the other day about there is a bakery that was preparing some good old fashioned treats, and the elderly couple that ran it, very nice elderly couple, and then I came across something that kind of surprised me, in that they had some sugar cookies that were covered in confectioner's sugar. It was not confectioner's sugar, powdered sugar. Very, very sweet cookies, very lovely cookies. They had nuts on the top, and this is true back in the day, and apparently in this particular instance today as well. They called that kind of cookie a Mexican wedding cake. Um, and the reason why, of course, I think this is a problem is because the perception that referring to that kind of small cookie as a Mexican wedding cake is that actually that name for it kind of creates um, an assertion or a comment on Mexicans and their financial status, because it's basically the expression is saying is this small cookie is what they could afford at a wedding, and it's not positive. And when we say politically correct, to say it's that using that terminology, and it creates that negative perception, that it reinforces negative stereotypes. And so maybe calling it, I don't know what we would call a cookie. I think it's just sweet cookie with nuts would be a great description. But the idea is that the name of it creates a perception and that's a result of the language choice. Um, and that affects how we view other types of contexts in certain situations. So it's really important that when we choose language, we choose language that we think illustrates our point, but at the same time, we don't want it to influence a negative perception either of ourselves, or maybe of a group of people that we are trying to help, or what have you. So, or a way to, you know, word language such that it doesn't create a negative perception on part of your audience. Um, so where we go here? Okay, so I have an example here. I think I explained an example here. We can read this. You can read that on your own time. We gotta move along here. I've already been ranting for 14 minutes. Um, so connotation and denotation. These are words that we use when we describe how to define or get at the meaning of words. So there's a denotation with each word, and that's the dictionary definition or basic meaning of a word. So denotation, again, goes with the D with dictionary. All right, that's the dictionary definition. Connotation is kind of the emotional reaction, or quote unquote understood between the lines meaning that goes along with the literal meaning. So, like the difference between smell and stench. There's a difference between the word smell and stench. Like if we were to define the denotation, though, we would say that, well, smell is, an unpleasant olfactory experience. And a stench would be an unpleasant olfactory experience, right? But there's a difference in the emotion and reaction and severity of those unpleasant olfactory experiences that would make a speaker choose the word stench over smell. Um, and that difference is a result of the connotation. All right, not the denotation. Like I said, those words in a dictionary were probably used as synonyms. They won't be that different from each other, whereas the connotation is very different. It is important for connotation, of course, to match the situation. You wouldn't walk into a room and go, "Oh, what's that stench?" Right? Because the way the vocal quality is, the enthusiasm behind it. Stench is supposed to be unpleasant, but it has a very cheery voice. It doesn't match the situation at all. People would think you're kind of funny um, if you did that. And so it's very important that when you choose words, you choose them carefully. You choose them to get the right emotional reaction. All right. So let's talk about some effective language here. You need to make sure that effective language is appropriate. So an example I typically give as well is that um, if a student came up to me and said, "Sup, Mr. P Dog, we doing anything at lecture?" Would that be appropriate for approaching a professor? Um, these days there's a lot of professors that go out of their way to be very casual and say things. Please call me by my first name. Please, um, don't hold back any. I want you to talk around here like you talk about like where how you talk with your family. Stuff like that. So this idea is changing, but I think most of us would say that if you called your teacher Mr. or Ms. Um, something dog, that you probably aren't being appropriate. Right? So you need to make sure that the language you're choosing is appropriate for the situation. And obviously, talking with your family is a different situation than, for example, in this class, giving a formal presentation, right? Um, we would definitely want to set up, regardless of how familiar we want to be with each other, there's a certain difference in this situation between just having a discussion back and forth in a video or broadcast or Skype between you and me versus you recording a video that's standing in for a professional presentation, right? So you need to ask yourself, is this word or are these words appropriate for the situation I'm in? Next, we have the idea that effective language, um, or rather language in general, can create a bias. So sometimes connotations can be used and or abused to create biased language. And so we have two examples here about the same phenomenon: aborting a pregnancy versus killing unborn children. One is a very technical kind of connotation that is more or less neutral, whereas another one is very aggressive. Killing is not the same thing as aborting, right? Aborting is about stopping a process from happening, like aborting a mission, aborting a save procedure on your computer versus killing, right? Killing has a very different connotation to it. Of course, there's a difference in the word choice between pregnancy and unborn children, right? Um, so there's one reason why, like anti-abortion groups, for example, will choose this form of language because they feel that using it they would argue better represents what's happening, but they also choose this language because using it consistently can create a bias or a perception that this process is immoral. And similarly with pro-life folks as well. In fact, the word pro-life is often chosen because it sounds warm and fuzzy, and they kind of get to sidestep the idea that the other side is saying that you're ending the life of an organism, right? Whether you call it killing unborn children is unfair or not, we can debate that. But at the same time, the other side is also choosing language to try to create a bias, right? And that's one reason why that issue and issues like it, and controversial issues like it, are difficult to wrap around because both sides are so entrenched in creating and choosing language that either sidesteps criticism or maybe skewers the other side in such a way that it's not really a fair representation of anyone's ideas. And that's really unfortunate because it really prevents a productive discussion. Um, anyway, so again, I'm not taking a stand either way or one way or the other. Like I said, you have to be aware that when people choose words, especially when they're part of a cause and a controversial cause, they're going to be choosing words to try to create a perception that creates a bias, hopefully in favor of their side or maybe against the other side. And if you're aware of that, you're far more likely to have a better attitude when you're reading those materials from either side. Anyway, grammar and word choice. Um, I'm not going to go over the video here because one reason why is because the other video that I had where I went over a video that you saw the cartoon I wanted you to discuss, um, that was flagged for copyright, so I can't show that. It's on the PowerPoint. You can click to it and watch it again on your own after the video's over, or you can pause this video here and watch it. But the thrust of this cartoon is that somebody um, really mangles an English paper. And the idea is that if their grammar is being so bad, just even though you can understand them, it's so sloppy and speaks so poorly of their ability to write that you would probably think that the person who wrote it was not really paying much attention, right? And that's why it's really important that you embrace clarity. And you want to use simple words. GRE words or words that are really complicated are not necessary, but you do need enough of a word. In other words, a word that has both a denotation and a good connotation. Not necessarily a good connotation in the idea that's positive, and you can have a negative connotation as well, but a good connotation in that it conveys some kind of emotional force, um, as opposed to being so neutral that your speech ends up being dry. But you need enough of a word to convey the image that the intended meaning. And that's often one word that you would hear a lot when we talk about good image use. We call it vivid. And, vivid is a word that evokes imagery. And that's kind of what we want. We want you to paint a picture with your words. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to describe, in detail the physical description of a person or an object or a phenomenon, but you choose words again that have those connotations that will give impart emotional force, and you want to use those words in such a way that you're not creating a bias, but you are creating the intended perception. All right. You also want accuracy, so you need to align the words that you choose. You need to align the phonology, how the word sounds, syntax, where the word would fit into a sentence, semantics, the intended meaning of the word, and pragmatics. Don't use words in an unusual way, right? Um, so sometimes, and this is hard because, and this kind of resolves around something that's more complex, and you'll hear it later in another either communication class or linguistics course. But there's this idea called code switching, in which um, you're very pragmatic in your word choice. For example, my mom is from Wisconsin. She calls water fountains bubblers. But consistently using the word bubbler in place of water fountain confuses the heck out of everybody around her. So for a pragmatic reason, she needs to choose. Over time she chose different, the water fountain to communicate with people from Indiana about what she meant. Um, and sometimes people will use language in a way that is technically incorrect, but they're understood anyways. So this is not a mistake. I mean, there were mistakes all over my PowerPoints generally, but this is not, right? So this is an example of that. Sometimes you can get away with botching syntax or botching the phonology because again, there's any way, not any ways. But you're still understood. You want to not do this as much as possible, though. You should really try to be technically correct while giving a public speech. All right. Again, because even though people can understand you, this word choice is still presenting a perception that maybe you were not very thoughtful. Right. Now, don't beat yourself up if you use a very common expression like anyways in your speech, because one thing, and I know I'm just giving you counter advice here, but one way that you can improve a rapport with your audience is by speaking like they do. And so sometimes it is appropriate if everybody around you uses the word bubbler and everyone around you uses the expression anyways, and they have a favorable perception of using those words, then pragmatically, maybe you should use those words as well. Kind of like a if in Rome, do as the Romans do type deal. So just some food for thought there. But what is vivid language? All right, I talked about that briefly a moment ago, but vivid language makes things more interesting. Vivid language can paint a picture in the mind's eye. You want language that is so vivid that we can imagine what's going on, right? Create or convey an emotional experience or create a sensory experience. So, do feel like you don't have to describe literally the sensory experience of everything. Sometimes students go overboard a little bit, and they'll introduce maybe we'll be talking about. I had a student once give a speech about the NFL chairman, and he had some really vivid language in there, but it went a little overboard because he was describing basically every pockmark on this guy's face, like literally talking about marks and things on his face and how they were relative they were to the eye and the nose. You like, there's a point where you can just kind of stop it. Like if you are intending to talk about how this person has a mean-spirited face, go ahead and describe how a mean-spirited face looks, but you don't need to go so far into the details about each and every nook and cranny. All right. Um, Now, again, there's another example that I included on here that you can click through. I think it's a really good example of how just using some simple words, strong bad, the poet here, um, can create imagery. And of course, it's a video, so you can kind of see what he's talking about as well. But even if you just listen to it, you can probably smell the things that he's describing to you. So it's a fun video. I think it really illustrates the point about what vivid language is. Please do watch this as an example. It's funny, it's silly. Again, I can't show it because apparently that's against copyright, so I don't want to flag. And it's not really against copyright. This is for educational purposes. But YouTube is automated, and I'm not going to fight the automation. Okay, so that's the first PowerPoint about language. So one of the things that we're going to work on throughout the semester is increasing the use of vivid language for your final speech. And it's not like your language so far has been poor. In fact, you all are very expressive. I've know your grades have not quite been showing up yet, but you have an excellent. Um, y'all are very expressive, and we're going to continue that tradition and maybe and intend that you improve your word choice. Like I said, it's not as a result of certain weaknesses. It's just that's we're going to take you from where you are and bring you to the next place. That kind of improvement. Um, where is my next one? Okay, so here comes your assignment. And I'm clicking around here looking for it. There it is. Let's make sure you can see the video because you cannot. There we go. So survey basics. Okay, so your next assignment for this week is to create a survey. I know I talked about logical fallacies maybe being covered today, but I goofed. I forgot we had, in order for you to write your report about the the fallacies you want to avoid, you kind of have to have some kind of basis on how your classmates feel about certain things, and you wouldn't know that until you give them a survey. So let's complete the first step of the process here by talking about how you create a survey, and then your assignment will be to actually create the survey and give it to your peers. So let's talk a little, just really briefly, about what surveys are good for. They're good for a couple of things, and well, they're good for a lot of things, and we're just interested in a couple of them, I should say. They're good for demographic analysis, seeing a snapshot of your audience, in other words. You want to understand their group memberships because even though there is a problem with stereotyping, people don't just join the Republican Party or join the Democratic Party unless they feel certain ways about certain issues, right? It's not going to be 100% agreement on any given issue within the group, but you can pretty well understand where somebody stands on certain issues based on their group memberships. Um, so that's important. You can also help determine analogies and metaphors. So if it turns out that you have a topic that for whatever reason involves a lot of Easter imagery. I had a student give for their final speech about um, the Easter Bunny and how she was afraid that the Easter was going to be as commercialized as Christmas. Well, and so you used a lot of analogies and metaphors and things that refer to the Bible. And one of the things that she really needs to determine before she gives that speech is whether or not, for example, does her audience go to church and or Bible study so that they would understand the analogies and metaphors that she's going to get into about Easter, for example. And because you can't necessarily take things like that for granted. Um, so it helps you determine those things as well, so you can communicate these abstract. Again, language is abstraction; it's not concrete. Um, so you have to determine how you can really best communicate. There's also psychological analysis, and again, you want to get a non-stereotypical picture of what your audience thinks. So group memberships again is a demographic analysis, and it can lead you some insight. But sometimes you might want to ask maybe an open-ended question about an issue in particular to see just how the individuals in your audience feel about it. And you also want to figure out, in a psychological sense, figure out what your audience already knows. If you're giving a speech, and I don't know why you would do this at this point in the semester, but if you're giving a speech about how to tie a shoe, maybe one thing you need to ask yourself or ask your audience is whether or not people know how to tie their shoes. Because if they do, your speech about them about tying your shoes or how to tie shoes is not going to be very useful. Um, so you need to figure out if your audience already knows much of the material you plan to cover. Um, so that is an excellent use of a survey. So most good surveys feature some of the following ideas. They feature some questions meant to get some demographic information. In other words, group memberships, um, even how old someone is, because maybe they, I'm reaching a point now where if I say things like back, when we watched GI Joe on Saturday morning cartoons, yada yada, this happened. There's an analogy, right? Um, People are like, what the heck is GI Joe? Saturday morning cartoons? What are you talking about? Well, people were too young. We actually Saturday morning cartoons. I couldn't believe it myself as a later 20-something, but apparently Saturday morning cartoons as a phenomenon has died out, and there are people nowadays that don't know what it's like to wake up and on a Saturday morning and early. I know it's crazy waking up early on a weekend to watch some cartoons, and they didn't know GI Joe because, of course, all the cartoons on Saturday were gone. Um, they only know about GI Joe from that really crappy movie they put out a few years ago. Not the awesome animated series that, when you look at it as an adult, was like, wow, this is really meant to sell toys. But anyway, the point is that sometimes asking somebody's age is important because maybe it will determine what kind of experiences they might have had in their life. Maybe another demographic information question is where people are from. If someone's from the city is probably not going to understand a whole heck of a lot about planting crops, and someone that's not from the city is not going to understand necessarily how. I'm trying to think of an example here that's not too extreme. Well, for example, took a group of students to New York, and we had a group of students that continued to cross the street even at a red light. And you'd be like, well, why is that not a bad thing? Well, that's because I know in Muncie and a lot of places in Indiana, you can cross the street when the cross traffic is at a red light. But you can't really in New York because there's so many cars. A lot of them are turning. They have the right of way to turn, and you can only really cross the street when there's an actual pedestrian you can cross now signal, and no one will turn into you as you walk across the street, right? So that kind of understanding was not shared by a lot of folks from Indiana who are from smaller cities that don't have the traffic that New York has, as an example. So that's another reason why demographic information is useful. Questions meant to evaluate what the audience knows about the topic. That's a big one. And again, most good surveys, as I'm ranting here, you need to have this kind of question. They need to have this kind of question. Especially if you're going to be giving a persuasive speech, you need to know how the audience feels about your proposal, and you want to try to get some kind of rich information. Okay, so um, here's your assignment. Now, step 0 before all of this is you need to make a decision about what your topic is, and it doesn't need to be um, the kind of things I've asked you before, like the specific purpose and things like that. I just want you to have an idea in your head before you write the survey about what you want to talk about. It could be you just want to talk about the rainforest. You're not exactly sure what about the rainforest you want to talk about yet. You don't have a specific purpose, but you do know you want to change people's minds about the rainforest. All right, that is the kind of idea that you need to have in your head before you begin. So that's step 0. Now the next thing is that you need all your questions must have a purpose, and your survey needs to be 10 questions long. You need to have some questions. Again, I know this is an ambiguous requirement, but I don't want to say each topic is different. Maybe you have picked a topic that you know is pretty obscure because you have experience. So maybe you won't ask some demographic questions, whereas another speech where it's really common that certain memberships have certain strong views about it, and so you might ask a lot of demographic questions to see whether anyone in the audience is aligned against your topic, for example. It really depends on what you want to talk about. But you need to still have some questions for demographic information. So let's interpret this sentence here as saying at least 2, right? Questions, plural. Um, but outside of that, it really depends on your best judgment. You need to um, remember that geographic location and socioeconomic status is also considered part of demographic information. So if you want to ask someone what kind of town are they from, or what kind of money maybe their family had while they were growing up, or whether they have to work right now in order to pay their bills for college, that's socioeconomic status information. That's still all that's all demographic information. You also want to have what we call a Likert scale, or some kind of scale. So that's a 5 or 10-point scale. Usually the terms go from like strongly agree to strongly disagree, but you can also insert other words here as well, like opposed to embrace, or you can have um, no, I'm still, I guess my brain's still fried from watering the flowers. But usually these kinds of things have a scale between, here's the strongest answer on this side and the strongest answer on that side, and there's usually 5 or 10 items on it. I don't care if you use 7. You do need to have more than 3, because usually then you're really just asking, do you agree? I don't know. Disagree. You can have a question like that, but that doesn't. I would say this doesn't fulfill the requirement for a Likert scale or a scale-like question. All right, but you can still have a question like that, but I still want something more complex than that, if you don't mind. And you also need to have an open-ended question, one open-ended question where you kind of ask them to their opinion, or some kind of a response where they need to write out a sentence at least. All right. Don't ask them to write an essay, because be respectful of their work, the time that they need. But do ask them some kind of question where you have to kind of actually read the responses, read what their thought is on whatever the topic is that you're asking about. Be simple in your survey. Try to avoid really complex surveys that are like, have you seen any Spider-Man movies? If no, skip to item 16. If yes, go right on to number 2. Right? That's very complicated. Just have a 10-item survey that goes from beginning to end. No skipping around. No skipping period. Just questions that don't require you to do a system like that. If you've taken some of these more complex surveys before, you know that some of them, that they're really poorly designed. I mean, I understand why you do them, because you don't want people answering questions that they don't have any experience or business asking. But you should really try to, that's not a concern for this class. Save that for your research methods class later in your degree program. Um, right now, we just want 10 questions, no skipping. It's fine. Questions should be direct. Try to avoid euphemisms. By euphemisms, I mean language that tries to avoid the issue. Um, if you're asking questions about a sensitive topic, that you're like, oh, somebody might be embarrassed to answer a question about this. That's actually probably a pretty good red flag that maybe you shouldn't do the topic. So this should be something that, if you're going to ask someone questions about it that are personal in nature, to the point, I mean, you can ask them do you personally like pepperoni pizza? And that's fine. But if you're getting to the point where you're like, ooh, somebody might be embarrassed, that's a good flag that maybe you just shouldn't broach that topic. Or at the very least, you should contact me and say, is there a good way to do this topic? I'm really, really passionate about it. For example, I had a student it turned out to be a great speech on comprehensive sex education. Um, and this student wanted to ask questions like, have you partaken in certain things? And I was like, no, we can't ask questions like that. There's other ways to get at the real information that you want, because you don't really want to know those things. What you really want to know is their opinion about those things. And so there's ways you can work around that. So again, if you have a topic that you think might be is a little controversial, but you still want to do it, I don't want to discourage you from tackling controversial things at all. Go ahead and contact me and say, is there a good way to ask this or that question, or how would I tackle asking questions about this topic? I can then give you some concrete advice there. But again, um, yeah, don't lead the audience. And so this is something that we struggle with. I struggle with it. Everybody struggles with this. In every survey I think I have seen, um, not necessarily from class, because these are fairly simple because I want them to be, but the more complex surveys that are about research, I mean, there's usually questions that slip in there that are leading in some way. So, for example, if I asked you, do you think your classes are a waste of time? Well, I've chosen words that already have a negative connotation, and you're already thinking along the lines of all the times that you've wasted time in class. Like, we all know that there are classes, heck, there are videos in this course that it seems like nothing really happens. You never learned anything. Like, we all know those moments, right? And by phrasing the question this way, you are helping the audience recall that information and be like, yeah, it is a waste of time. Because by the way, it's just the way that your language created a perception that biased their response. Um, so maybe you could ask them more neutral questions like, how do you feel about class sessions? This is another maybe not quite, and again, are class sessions productive for you? This word is pretty positive, right? So they're already thinking, well, like, the times I was glad I showed up to class or glad I was watched the whole video. That primes your brain for thinking about stuff like that. And again, another leading way to do it. You don't want to do this. You might want to ask a direct question like, how do you feel about class sessions? Great open-ended question that asks for their opinion. All right. And that's often a way that you can not lead your audience. Is that I'm afraid I might lead the audience with this question, but I still want to know this information. Ask it open-ended. Right? Don't form a conclusion with them by putting some kind of value judgment in here, like waste, productive, good, bad, um, uh, fit, fat, um, any kind of thing where you're asking someone to pass judgment on something. You can just get rid of that part and just say, uh, what was your opinion about the Spider-Man movie? Don't ask them, do you think Spider-Man was good? Do you think Spider-Man was bad? Right? Don't ask questions like that. Instead, just say, what did you think about Spider-Man? Or how would you rate Spider-Man on a scale of it's the worst thing I ever saw to I'm going to go see it 10 more times, right? right? Um, that kind of idea there. Okay, so there is a discussion forum for you to post your 10 questions. There will be a quick tutorial on Sunday about how you can send your class the questions quickly. I want you to design your survey because it requires you to pick your topic first and then formulate some questions. Um, and I would like for us to have that done on Sunday. But there again, this will be something you post under discussion section. Um, and that's where I will see it. That's where I'll grade it, and I'll give you completion points. And that's another thing I wanted to bring up. Somebody asked me like, how am I evaluating those discussions? It's completion. Like I want to look and make sure that you are doing it, and that you're consistently doing it. That's your discussions are really kind of standing in as a way for me to interact with you. Um, and honestly, and for some of them, I know that you and I don't really write back and forth on the thread, but it is a way for me to see and for everyone else to see what your comments are. I get to look at the statistics for the discussion, and you do look at each other, even if I don't invite you to. Um, to comment on each other. At least some of you read it. And I am pleased also to see that many of you are write supportive things, even though it's not really part of the assignment. So anyway, rant over. You will post this on the discussion section on Sunday. I will write out this thing in an announcement to make sure that everyone knows that. Let's see. I haven't looked at the chat window for a gosh awful long time. Looks like there's a few people watching, but there's nothing in chat. I guess I lucked out on that one. In any case, this is your assignment. It's due Sunday at midnight. I really appreciate the effort that you all are doing this semester. Like I said, this next speech, this final speech, is going to be more detail oriented, but I know that you all are doing well, and you could probably continue to do so. I have every confidence in you. So have a great evening.